Hey, everybody, welcome to Positively Atheist. This is on my first official video, and I thought it would be very fitting to make my first official video a story about my deconversion experience and what led me to leave my faith that I so cherished and loved and become the, the positively atheist person I am today. Um, the story goes, I've now been an atheist for about almost 10 years now. My deconversion happened on an Easter Sunday about 10 years ago, literally in the middle of a church service. I've had a lot of people ask me uh, why it happened, how it happened, and I thought this video would be kind of cool to share for some of you guys, some of you people who are out there uh, involved in religion, you're involved in different types of religion. You've also, maybe you've been doubting, maybe you haven't. But I want to go back and explain how I went from being in the youth ministry as a pastor for about in different youth ministry aspects for about 8 years to now be an atheist for about 10 years. It starts off when I was younger. I was raised in a typical American household, not super religious, but also there was some religion involved. My parents were had spiritual beliefs, had religious beliefs, and we went to church very frequently. In fact, that was the primary activity that we did as a family, or I did as a young person as well. Literally, just going to church services, Sundays, Wednesdays, went to summer camps, participated in all those activities. And I loved it. I had this certain personality type where I was drawn to that religious experience. Um, First baptized at 9 years old in the Southern Baptist Church, and then later I was baptized around 14 or 15. Actually, I was close to 16 in the Assemblies of God Church. So I've transitioned from both very conservative in lifestyle approaches and social issues, but I went from a very somewhat conservative perspective on theology and religion to a more liberal perspective of theology and religion. I shouldn't say liberal, but um, uh, more emotionally based. Went from more like the Southern Baptist to me came across as a very intellectual approach to religion, very cold approach, and the Assemblies of God had more of the emotional uh, feel that came from within. If you don't know the difference, I'll get into those differences in another video. But um, the Assemblies of God, we practice things like speaking in tongues as an example. Like I said, that's not really important for this video. I'll get into those what that is in another video where I'll explain more about that. But I was always very active in the church. I was in youth ministry, very active in it. I was always in some type of worship band. I played guitar and sang. Um, and like I said, I was very passionate about it. Most of my time was spent around my religious belief, and I used to not listen to anything other than Christian music. I went for most of my life not hearing any of the popular music that was out. I heard it, but I didn't pay attention to it. I was busy learning worship music, busy singing worship music. This was my life, and for me, it was never really superimposed by my family. Even though my family had religious beliefs, this wasn't something directly pushed on me. This is something I was naturally drawn to. I enjoyed the experience. It gave me a sense of community, gave me a sense of meaning and purpose that I found through this, and it was very powerful for me. You know, I like to tell people, hey, well, like when I was in my faith, I was living the life. Like, yeah, I did a couple of, I had a high school girlfriend, I had this and that and the other thing, but overall, like I worked, I took a lot of pride in my level of commitment to my belief. Like I wasn't at the parties, I wasn't doing all the stuff all the kids were doing my age. I was When I had free time, I was in the church. I was and helping set up worship bands. I was helping focus on building God's kingdom here on earth. Well, as time went on, I ended up going into youth ministry. I served as a campus missionary for Youth for Christ for several years, and then I had a couple years stint as a youth minister at a couple different churches. Um, when the starting my deconversion experience was, it started with my belief in what's called speaking in tongues. Now, in the Assemblies of God, if you're not familiar, speaking in tongues is a practice and a belief, but what's what they call one of their fundamental foundations of truth, which is that if you're filled with what they call filled with the Holy Spirit, that you will show this through evidence in speaking in tongues. Now, it's important to distinguish. They never taught us that speaking in tongues was what saved you. Well, instead, what they said is, hey, look, if you're filled with God's Holy Spirit, you will speak in tongues. Now, speaking in tongues there's a couple different perspectives on speaking in tongues and what it's about. But traditionally speaking in tongues has been viewed as the ability for a person to speak a language that they had not learned, but speak it in an intelligible way that a native speaker of that language could hear it. And if you look at the book of Acts and the stories that were told about how the apostles went out and were preaching different languages that they didn't know and preaching to people in languages that were unlearned for them. This is the typical view of speaking in tongues. Now, in the Assemblies of God Church, we actually took it a step further. We said, look, they recognized that there was this that there was a gift of tongue, this speaking in tongues as a spiritual gift. But then they had new usefulness of it, and they found other scriptures to support this, where speaking in tongues is not only a spiritual gift that needed to be interpreted, but you could have the gift, the actual gift of tongues themselves, where there's the ability for you to have essentially a personal prayer language that you have between you and God that only God can understand. So these were we would be speaking like babbling tongues is the best word I can explain it. And it gave us a huge emotional rush. We would be speaking in these babbling languages. And for me, it was a very personal experience, because this is not something only I just believed, but it was also something that I was actively participating in. Now, looking back, I have certain explanations for why I did the things I did and how those things worked. But at the time, they were very real to me. Like I experienced this phenomenon, being able to speak in another language that you didn't understand what it was, right? And I could do it on demand right now. It sounds something like just to throw it out there, like shubura samadara, something like this. You'll hear this, and if you ever watch any charismatic like Christian or like TV shows or something like that, you'll hear people doing this. There was an old joke. It said, I can't remember how it was, but it was like kind of making fun of this phenomenon. And people would say, I arrived in a Honda, left in a Mazda. It has this certain role to it where you're, obviously I'm making it up now, just like I was making it up then. But for me then, it was very meaningful, very empowering. The idea that I was having this real, true connection with God himself. Now, the reason why I tell you about that is because as I look back on my Christian faith, ironically, I was never a person who really doubted anything. I never doubted the stories I read. I never doubted the idea of a guy being in the belly of a well for 3 days. I've never doubted the stories of a talking snake, talking donkey. None of that stuff ever even crossed my mind. I believe the earth was, at the time, I believe the earth was 6,000 years old. And I had all these beliefs that I never really even doubted. And it wasn't until I was a youth pastor at a church in Central Florida where I, for the first time, really truly started doubting my beliefs. And what happened was somebody actually sent me a book called The Gift of Tongues. I think I still have it, but I can't seem to find it. But it's a little pamphlet book. It was probably like 35 pages, 40 pages. And it was called The Gift of Tongues. It was written by what's called a cessationalist, which is a person or teacher who, and a lot of like traditional Southern Baptist organizations fall in this respect. They believe that the spiritual gifts were for the apostles, and that when the apostles all died, the spiritual gifts, like the gift of healing, the gift of prophecy, the gift of tongues, all those things were basically retired, right? So they don't, a cessationist doesn't believe in the active current gifts of spirit. Now, this was in direct conflict of what I had been taught as what I had been taught in the Assemblies of God, and what I had been taught growing up in other places too, and on what I had been teaching other people. And in the book, it basically made the case from the scriptural perspective, laying out all the scriptures that have to do with speaking in tongues, using babbling tongues, which is like incoherent language, all these different things. And it made the case for me that what I was doing, the speaking in tongues that I was doing, the gift of tongues, was not only not biblical, but that it was actually, in some cases, could be considered demonic. Now, for me, that shook me to the core, because it didn't make any sense. How could I be participating in something for so long and have such a firm conviction in it, but then come to find out that it's total bullcrap, that I have been misled, I have been misleading other people? When I got finished with that booklet, I was convinced that it was right. That was my first time ever really truly examining a core belief that I had, and actually discovering that I was incorrect. And a lot of people don't have never had that experience before. A lot of people have never had an experience where they've believed something very deeply, but then found evidence that convinced them otherwise. And if you haven't had that experience, it's hard to explain. But when I had that experience, I was in a tough spot. I was a youth pastor in an Assemblies of God church, that one of the core teachings of our denomination was that if you feel the Holy Spirit, you'll have speak in tongues. And I struggled with this, to be honest with you. Like, I didn't know what to do. Um, I made the internal determination that I was no longer going to participate in that activity anymore. I made the internal decision that it's not, quote unquote, of God, right? These are the determinations I came to internally. But here I am, still a youth pastor in an organization that expects me to teach a certain doctrine, which I didn't agree with. So the way I handled that as a youth pastor was, I just chose not to talk about it. Like, I ended up going down a whole nother rabbit trail where I started really diving into the Bible, trying to learn what God has to teach me through the Bible. Because for me, the big experience was, wow, there's an independent way for me to come to truth if I'll just open my mind up to what the Bible says to me, right? And like really truly examine it. And to me, this is one of the big turning points for me in my belief. I got to the place where I said, look, I don't care if I'm wrong about everything. I want to know the truth, capital T truth. So this led me down a path of getting into expository preaching as youth pastor. I went from doing like topical preaching to verse by verse preaching. In that time, I literally just started going verse by verse through my preaching. I stopped talking about the topics. I stopped trying to do that. And surprisingly, my youth ministry started exploding. When I started going through the Bible verse by verse, youth ministry was growing exponentially. We went from having like 10 or 12 students to our youth ministry to sometimes having 100, 150, so many that we couldn't fit them in our building. Now, the problem is, though, that the leadership of the church, specifically my pastor at the time, he started noticing some things about me, noticing that I wasn't as I don't know how to describe it, other than I wasn't myself, because deep down inside I was really struggling. I was struggling with the fact that I just felt like a phony. I was part of this church denomination. I didn't believe some of the core doctrines, but it was a struggle. But to me, this issue was a primary issue. So in order to work around this issue, I even went to the extent of, whenever my pastor came to me, it's like, hey, I want you to do a series on speaking in tongues. That's when I realized he started sensing that I wasn't quite on board. My response to him was simply, look, I would actually prefer the students hear it from you. Let them hear it from you, because you've already got a series put together. So I literally took my ministry and paused it. On Wednesday nights, we paused and we actually went into the main service and got a chance for the students to hear directly from the pastor the source. I never talked bad about it. I never said anything negative, but I just thought this was a good way to deal with this issue without having to create a confrontation. So weeks went by. He was doing like a 4 or 5 week series on the gift of tongues. So I closed youth ministry down. We took the youth group in there, got the chance to hear him. Finally, towards the end, he actually approached me in my office and said, "Hey, look, I feel like there's something amiss here. I feel like you're not really on board with some of these teachings. Why aren't you doing a series yourself?" And it was at that time I went ahead and told him my experience. Broke it all down for him, told him what I just told you. And, my response was simply, "Hey, look, this doesn't have to be a deal breaker. We still both believe in, the overall principles of salvation by grace and the standard Protestant stuff." But his response was simply, "Hey, look, this may not be a deal breaker for you, but it's a deal breaker for me. So go ahead and pack up your stuff and go ahead and head out." So this was the end of my my youth pastor at this particular church. And that was a hard moment for me. It was a hard moment for a lot of reasons. Obviously, like, this was my life goal. I had worked years to become a youth pastor. It's very important to me. And honestly, I really hadn't even developed any other skill sets in my life, because my whole life had been based on the ministry. And here I am losing my job over what I consider to be a secondary issue. Now, I tell that story because that was for me, a pivotal moment. That was the first time in my life that a real core, deep truth that I had, one that was so personal, so something that was honestly embarrassing. When I look back, there's still recordings of me speaking in tongues, and it's an embarrassing part of my life. It's an embarrassing part that I was able to be mentally. It concerns me that I was able to get to the place where I was able to be controlled. My mind was able to be controlled in such a way. And it led me down another path, which is where, since I knew that it was possible for me to be misled, it led me down this other path where now I wanted to make sure that it would never happen again. I wanted to make sure that no matter what, I would never get played like that again. And so I pursued what I considered the truth on a level that I never pursued before. I got into reading the Bible like King James only version. I ended up moving from more of an Arminian perspective of grace and salvation to a Calvinistic perspective. If you don't know the difference between that, I'll do another video on that. But more of a very Bible literal perspective on my interpretations. And I got really extreme for a while. I got to the point where I was following some of the great, like, founding fathers of Christianity, learn about street preaching, and I got heavily involved in street ministry. Going out, I was literally out in street corners preaching, holding up signs. I got so entrenched in this and so consumed by wanting to know the truth that it drove me to the point where I literally have a Jehovah's Witness temple that has that has asked me not to return their property, because I would go there and proselyte. I would share what I considered the gospel and the quote unquote good news of Jesus Christ. And I got to the point to honestly where I was just a bitter person, because I was really on this journey, was consuming my mind. What is the truth? I felt like I knew what the truth was, but then I felt like that there was so much more to learn, and I kept diving down deeper in this rabbit hole. Well, this process took me down the path of becoming I started like having a passion for witnessing to people. Like, I would go on the streets, pass out gospel tracts, and I started having really good conversations with people from all different faiths for the first time in my life, like really deep conversations about theology, about their beliefs. I was talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. I was talking to Buddhists, Muslims, and having incredibly deep conversations. And I became what you would probably consider obsessed with what I would call at the time cults, Christian cults. So I started getting obsessed with the Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, and that obsession led me to learn a lot about specifically the Mormon belief structure, which, to be honest, it kind of blew me away. Like, I had heard stuff about what Mormons believe growing up from my Christian background, but I never really had really truly engaged in meaningful conversations with Mormons. Well, I ended up running across a series online called The Heart of the Matter with Sean McCraney. He wrote a book called Born Again Mormon, where he outlines his experience of going from a Mormon to a born again Christian. I used to love the show. The production value was low, was crappy, but the information I just could not get enough of. I was listening to the Mormon stories, the stories of Joseph Smith. And what got me was I saw these stories, I listened to them, I listened to all the breakdowns of how everything happened with the golden tablets, and how the Pearl of Great Price, and how all these things were developed. And in my mind, I thought to myself, this is obviously ridiculous. Like, these stories are insane. Um, Joseph Smith was an obvious phony. No offense to any Mormons out there. Like, in my mind, I was just like, this is ridiculous. How can anyone actually believe this stuff? It didn't make any sense to me, because to me, as a born again Christian, I easily looked at this stuff and I said, this is silly. Like, it doesn't make any sense how anyone can believe this. But then when I actually got to know the Mormons, a lot of the Mormons, listen, many of the Mormons I met are some of the smartest people I've ever met. Some of the most intelligent, some of the most well-studied, some of the most educated, some of the most successful people I ever met were Mormons, which led me down another really big question in my mind, which was, how could it be that otherwise extremely intelligent, well-mannered, professional, successful people can believe what I viewed as an obvious sham? How can they believe it so much? And the level in which they believed it was also blew me away. The level that they believed the stuff as strongly, if not stronger, than I believed in what I believe in, and certainly more than what other people I believe in. Because remember, going on this path of Bible literalism and this extreme perspective of Christianity, I started looking down on other Christians because I didn't feel like that they were serious about their faith. I'm out here preaching, sharing the gospel, handing out Bible tracts, having conversations with people, and I felt like, where are my other Christian brothers and sisters? They don't believe this stuff as strongly as I do. But then I look at the Mormons and I see the level of dedication to something that I saw was frankly silly. And I think that's what it did it for me. This is a process that happened. And I remember distinctly, as all this is going on, I found myself asking the question, what if I'm wrong? How would I know if I'm wrong? Because the thing is if these people can believe in something that's obviously fake, obviously phony in my mind, then what does that say about me? How would I know if what I'm believing is fake or phony? And this search for truth for me was a process that happened that I think began the process of freeing my mind from my experience. And looking back, we call this the outsider's test of faith. This is, and what I tell, basically it's, if you were a third person outside of your faith, coming to your faith for the first time, hearing the stories, hearing the claims, what would you think about it? Right. And this is so important for me. I never even thought about it. And honestly, I never really thought about that hard. I went about my faith. I was worshiping Jesus. I was going to church. I was a member of the worship band. I was deeply ingrained in my my church at the time. I was no longer a youth minister, but I was still very involved in my local church. And honestly, I was happy. I had good friends, good social network, and I never had a bad experience in church. In fact, I missed that experience. I missed the experience of having people who feel like extended family to me, um, that came from being part of a church. But there was something deep inside of me that was just eating away these questions of, what if I'm wrong? How do I know who's right? And if two people can read the same Bible but come out with different conclusions from it, what does that say about the Bible? What does that say about what we're reading? Is this a good pathway towards truth? These are all internal dialogues I'm having with myself in my mind. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in a Sunday service. It was almost 10 years ago now. I think it was 10 years ago this year. And it was Easter sermon, and it was essentially the same one you hear every year at Easter, which is talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I believe it's Paul who says, if Christ be not raised from the grave, then our faith is in vain. And when I heard those words for the first time, I just asked myself, did Jesus rise from the grave? And I remember asking myself that in my head, and I just was like, I don't know. And as soon as it happened, it was like instantly, I felt like an out of body experience, almost not in a real way, but I just could see myself sitting in this pew surrounded by a bunch of people. And I felt like I was sitting in the middle of a Mormon church, surrounded by a bunch of people who didn't believe what I believed, who believed something that was obviously not substantiated by any kind of actual evidence. And I felt like a stranger for the first time. And I'll never forget that moment because it changed me. So immediately after that service, I ended up going down this path of started getting into watching YouTube videos. Specifically, I became obsessed with the resurrection. I'm obsessed with it. Like, so what I wanted to do was I watched pretty much at the time every debate that was out there on the resurrection. Did Jesus rise in the grave? Did Jesus exist? These kind of questions. And I found that the debates I was watching, I love debates because no, I mean, let me change that. It's not that I love debates, right? Nobody likes to hear people arguing, but I like the formal debates because what I like about that is you have two different people from two different perspectives, both of them very well versed in their perspective, coming at the audience, giving it their best shot to explain their perspective. And then the back and forth to me was a great opportunity for me to listen to a different person's perspective. And I ended up watching pretty much every debate on the resurrection, every debate on whether or not Jesus exists. And then that evolved into whether or not God exists. Because at some point I decided in my head, I'm like, there just isn't evidence for Jesus dying or raising from the grave. There's not any evidence he even died, or to be honest, there's not really even a lot of evidence that he even existed outside of people saying he did. And I thought, this is not a place this is not enough to build a belief system on. Then I ended up getting to whether or not God existed, and I found the same problems. And over the period of a couple of years, I just had no choice but to reject those beliefs. And they fell one by one. It wasn't like an instant process, but I ended up where I am now, which is I just don't see any evidence for any of this. And this isn't to say that I don't believe none of it's true. I'm not saying that it's all wrong. And I'm not saying there are no gods, right? But I'm just saying right now, I just don't have enough evidence to believe any of it. And so that's my story about how I walked away from my faith. A lot of people ask me, well, what's your evidence that's not true? And to be frank, I don't have any. And I don't think it's my responsibility to have that information. I think it's a responsibility of people who are making these claims to provide the evidence. You don't go into a court of law having to prove your innocence. It's the prosecution's responsibility to prove your guilt. And so in the case of whether or not Jesus existed, died on the cross, raised from the grave, whether or not God exists, I personally find the defendant innocent, right? The God is not guilty in my mind of existing. There's been no credible evidence that's been presented outside of personal experience. And it seems that when you look at all the cases made for God, all the cases made for Jesus, it all boils down to the same thing. Somebody said it was true. And as a person who values truth, like I want to know as many true things as possible, and I want to reject as many false things as possible. As a person who is like this, I simply just can't believe it anymore. No matter how bad I want to, no matter how bad I want it to be true. And let's be honest, nobody likes the idea of dying forever, right? Nobody likes the idea of there not being a heaven or not, whatever, or ultimate justice. It's not that I don't want those things to be true. I could envision a reality in which I would hope. I mean, I love like Harry Potter. I love these different stories of like magic, and I would love the idea for all this to be true. But so far, I haven't seen the evidence of it, and because I haven't seen the evidence, I can't believe in it, not yet. And if you're watching this and maybe you have some insight, you have some information you want to share with me or other people, throw in the comments section. I just want to share a real quick story about how I became an atheist. And now where I'm at right now is this is where I am. I don't have any of those beliefs. I tend to only believe things that have evidence with them. And I think that's such an important position to be at, because at the end of the day, let's imagine this is where I come to. Let's imagine there is a God. Let's imagine there is a heaven and there's a hell, right? And let's imagine we don't really know who that God is yet at this point, right? Because it's the truth. We don't know. All we have is stories from people who claim their interpretation is real and their interpretation is true. We have all these different stories. We have Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, different branches of Christianity, right? And all of these different belief systems are mutually exclusive, meaning they're mutually exclusive and contradictory. They can't all be true, right? Allah can't be the only one true God, and Muhammad be his one true prophet, at the same time that Jesus is the one true Son of God who leads you to salvation through grace, right? These are mutually exclusive claims. They can't all be true. And Christianity specifically teaches that it's the only way to salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, right? So these are completely mutually exclusive claims. And where I'm at now is I say, look, I don't have any way as a third party to examine these claims and find out who's telling the truth. So at this point, my only option is to not believe. I don't have a belief in any of these. I don't believe in any of them being particularly true, right? And the reason why I say this is because I'd like to think that if there's a God, right, and I die and I walk up to or float up to this God or this deity, I'd like to think that whatever it is, whatever this source is, whatever that might be, if it were true, that it would be honorable enough. It would be intellectually honest enough to look at me and say, hey, look, I see your heart. I see that you wanted to believe, but you just didn't have enough information. And the fact that you chose to withhold that belief until the information was provided shows to me that you are intellectually honest, that you're a person of honor and integrity, that you're a person who was willing to risk dying, risk suffering, just for the sake of holding out for the truth, the capital T truth. And to me, if there's a God, I would hope that he would respect that, or it would respect that, right? And that it would dignify that. And I kind of have like a running joke that if there's a God, it might be the atheists are the ones that end up going to heaven, because we're the only ones who were honest enough and value the truth enough to withhold those beliefs until such a time they were demonstrated. And I think that if there's a God, I hope that's the case. Whether or not I would like that God or whether or not we would get along, that's a whole different scenario. And that's another topic for another video. But this is where I am, and this is how I got to where I am. And I would encourage all of you out there who are watching to really ask yourself, if I were a third person on the outside, not believing what you believe, not believing what somebody else believes, somebody who has neutral beliefs, doesn't have any positions on any of this, and they were to walk up in a conversation between you and a Muslim, a Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Hindu, Buddhist, and y'all were having a conversation about who has the one true path to God, or even whether or not there is a God, I would challenge you to ask yourself, if this person were listening to this conversation, what independent method could they use to arrive at your conclusion, to decide that you're telling the truth and that everybody else is wrong? And I'll leave you with this. Throughout history, there have been thousands upon thousands of different gods, of different religions. Some would argue there's a different religion for every single person, because no two people agree 100% on the nature of God, the theology of God, and the religious preferences therein. If that's true, if there are thousands upon thousands, countless different versions of gods and deities and religions, what's the likelihood that you just so happen to stumble across the true one? What's the chances? What are the odds? And this is a serious question that you should ask yourself. What are the odds that you just so happen to be born in the right spot, with the right parents, with the right religious upbringing, that helped you find that one true path? They can't all be true by definition, but they can all be wrong. So I would challenge everybody out there, if you are a person who's seeking after truth, you're a person who's seeking after the capital T truth, ask yourself these questions. What are the chances that I'm wrong? What are the chances that I'm right? And then what information do I have that would be sufficient for an independent observer to come to the same conclusions that I came to? And I think when you go down that path and you discover the answer to those questions, I think it will reveal a lot about your belief, just like it did for me. And dealing with the aftermaths of my deconversion is a whole nother story, because so many people are afraid to ask these questions because of what may result. And hopefully this channel will help you guys in that journey, if that's a path that you go down, providing you information, stuff that I've learned, stuff that I've been doing to help with the deconversion and transition experience out of faith into a position of like secular belief, if you would say, in the scientific method, understanding how things operate in the natural world. But this video isn't about all that. This video is about my deconversion experience, and hopefully it'll help some of you guys in your path as you are trying to find the truth, the capital T truth. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, smash the subscribe button, smash the like button. I would really appreciate it. If you have some comments, throw it in the comment section. I'd love to get your feedback, ideas, thoughts. If you have any questions about this story, about my deconversion experience, my life as an atheist, then I will be happy to fill those questions in any way I can. Thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to keeping things positively atheist for you guys out there in YouTube land. Thanks.